So thank you for joining the Functional Medicine Discussion Group of Santa Monica, so we can bring the functional medicine community together, so we can collaborate, so we can better help our patients. Please participate. This is a discussion, and Darin's got plenty of things to talk about, but it'd be great if everybody can ask questions and bring your own experiences to the meeting here. So I want to thank Metagenics, our sponsor for this evening, and so I want to talk about a few of their products. So for patients who have immune problems, they offer a neat way to test for zinc deficiency, which is a very important nutrient for the immune system. So this is the zinc tally test. So you can do it in office. You have the patient put some of this liquid zinc into their mouth, and if they don't taste anything, that's an indication that they're have a high likelihood of being deficient or insufficient in zinc, and so then you can recommend zinc, which, as you all know, is an important nutrient for the immune function. So they offer this zinc AG, which is a combination of two really highly absorbable forms of zinc, and they also offer Immunocore, which is a combination of absorbable zinc with vitamin C, vitamin D, and also medicinal mushrooms. So thank you to Metagenics and their great products for helping us in our functional medicine practice. So we're going to talk about Lyme disease today. As everybody knows, this is a very complicated and confusing disease, and it begins with an acute infection, except a lot of patients are not aware that they were ever even bitten by a type of bacteria, a corkscrew-like bacteria, typically known as Borrelia burgdorferi, although now we know that there are quite a number of different strains, including Borrelia miyamoto, found more commonly on the West Coast. I'm sure I'm butchering these terms. Borrelia mayoni, found in the Midwest, Borrelia guarini, and Borrelia afzelii, found in Europe. After the initial infection, Lyme may create a chronic condition that's very difficult to detect and difficult to treat, and this is what we're probably coming into experience with in our practices with chronic patients who don't seem to get better, who have a whole series of different symptoms. The CDC estimates that there are approximately 300,000 new cases of Lyme disease per year in the US, and thanks to global warming, it seems to be increasing, and in parts of the United States where it never existed before. I'm very happy that Dr. Darin Ingels will be joining us today to explain how we deal with Lyme disease with our patients. He's a licensed naturopathic doctor, and he's practicing in Irvine. He was also practicing in Connecticut, and now he's full-time in Irvine. And his practice focuses on environmental medicine with a specialty in Lyme disease and autism. And he's published 3 books, and his newest book is the Lyme Solution, which is a great read, and he has a step-by-step approach for how to help you deal with patients. He was nice enough to bring some copies of his book. Anybody who'd like to get a copy, they're $20, and he'll sign it for you. So. Darin, thank you for joining us today.
Great. This doesn't work. It does work? No?
Oh, let's see.
Is it muted?
Yeah, is that one not working?
It was.
Oh, you're
It
right.
was.
Yeah, no.
4?
It's not. Ben,
What?
he's cut off on the photo.
Oh, he's cut off. Well, we're going to sit down.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just trying to get the mic to work.
Does that work? Oh, there we go.
Okay. Good, good, good.
So I will try and hold it far enough away that we don't get the bad echo. Is that okay? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
good,
So,
good, good.
perfect.
Okay,
Very
so,
sensitive mics.
Yeah.
so I thought we'd start by, how did you become so interested in Lyme disease?
Well, I became interested because I got Lyme disease. That's a pretty, good way to get interested in any condition, when you get it yourself. So I moved to Connecticut in 2000, and I'd worked at a clinic, and then I ended up branching off on my own. And 3 weeks before I opened my own practice, I got infected. And I actually got classic Lyme disease. So I had 105 fever, headache, throbbing migraine, joint pain, peripheral neuropathy, and I had meningitis when I was in college. So I thought I had meningitis again, and I was actually getting ready to go to the hospital. And as I was changing clothes, this was June in Connecticut, it was hot and humid, changing clothes, and my ex-wife says, "Oh, what's that on the back of your leg?" What do you mean? So I did the double mirror thing, and there's a big bullseye right in the back of my leg. I'm like, okay, well, we can skip the ER now. I know what the problem is, so it's Lyme disease. And it's funny, so I go to the urgent care clinic, and they're like, "Why are you here?" I'm like, "I have Lyme disease." And the nurse is like, "Well, how do you know?" I'm like, "Big bullseye rash." So she's like, "Okay, yeah, you got Lyme disease." And I went through the standard, 21 days of doxycycline, and after 4 days of doxy, I felt fine. But, any of you guys who own your own business know what it's like when you're a new business owner, you're everything. So I just started my practice. I was the doctor, the receptionist, the bookkeeper, and working 10, 12-hour days. And after about 8 months, I started getting symptoms again. And now it's February in Connecticut, so there's not a lot of ticks that are active in the dead of winter in Connecticut. And as I was relapsing, I said, okay, fine. I went on antibiotics before, I'll go on again. And I went on, and it did nothing. And then I changed antibiotics, and it did nothing. And I went through about 9 months of changing antibiotic protocols, and actually got worse and worse, and my health really deteriorated very quickly. I lost 25 pounds. My stomach was a wreck, and just really felt horrible. So I was fortunate to see a Chinese medical doctor in New York City named Dr. Zhang. And he started treating me with Chinese herbs, and within a month, I was 85% better. So it was really kind of my wake-up call that I needed to come back to my naturopathic roots and really start looking at, what is it that was kind of allowing this infection to persist. And it makes it sound more simple than it really is. It took, over 3 years to get my health back, but I found, through changing my diet and paying attention to my sleep pattern and really paying attention to the terrain, it was the thing I needed to really kind of get over the hump. And I did herbs and I did other types of treatments, and I probably went through every single treatment that your Lyme patients have gone through as well. And so, that's kind of what precipitated the book. It's, what worked for me, what I found worked for my patients. And, what I really discovered in my own process is that, once you get past that initial infection, Lyme really has the capacity, and the research corroborates this, that it really triggers an autoimmune reaction. So, when you start thinking about Lyme as an autoimmune disease more than an infection, you're going to see a shift in how people react. So, that was my introduction. And ironically, I was a microbiologist before I was a doctor. So I used to do Lyme Western blots for a living. And it's funny, when I first started in the lab in 1990, the only the only lab in the country was doing Lyme testing was Mayo Clinic. So we sent all of our samples out to Mayo Clinic, and then finally we started getting enough. We said, okay, we'll bring it in-house, and started doing it. So I had actually a pretty broad background in infectious diseases. So that background plus my own experience is kind of, now my practice is really kind of surrounded around Lyme.
So what kind of symptoms first would alert you to look for Lyme disease as a possibility?
Well, when you read a medical textbook, you hear about the classic Lyme symptoms. Strangely enough, out of the thousands of people I've treated, probably less than 50 have actually had classic Lyme symptoms, where they get the headache and the joint pain and the fever and the bullseye rash. The CDC tells you that up to 80% of people who get infected will get the erythema migrans rash. The research says no, maybe it's 30%, maybe on a good day. So it's clearly not even close to half the people who get infected. So that rash certainly doesn't become a determinant about whether you've been exposed to Lyme or not. Most people with acute Lyme, they're acutely sick. You can get any number of manifestations, but you'll get the fatigue, you'll get the swollen glands, you might see Bell's palsy, you might get the high fever. I had a child here in Orange County who was admitted to Children's Hospital of Orange County with, again, he had a very high fever, he had joint pain, he had all the Lyme symptoms, and the head of infectious diseases at CHOC said, there is no Lyme in California, you don't need to worry about it. Mom is CDC positive, by the way, for Lyme, and she was begging them, just test him, please, and they refused to do it. So, and of course I tested him, and his Western blot lit up like a Christmas tree. So, if you look at the CDC map even, you'll see that California, particularly the Bay Area, is this emerging area of Lyme. But not just that, it's also a huge growth of ticks. There's an interesting map they published. They look at the spread of ticks versus just the spread of Lyme. and you'll see that the migration of ticks outside of New England and the central Midwest has really, exploded. So pretty much the entire East Coast now, moving down the south through Texas, and then again we got this corridor along the West Coast, are really grown a lot in ticks. And where there's ticks, there's potentially Lyme. So.
Do you think that Lyme can be spread by other organisms besides ticks?
Yeah, there's some research out of Europe that shows that both mosquitoes and fleas can transmit Lyme. And it's interesting. I work with a doctor whose son is an entomologist in Florida, and he studies mosquitoes. And he's adamant that no, there's no Lyme in mosquitoes. I'm like, okay. Well, there's research that says otherwise. And they said, well, that research was done in Europe. I'm like, so?
Yeah.
The fact that you haven't studied it here doesn't mean it's not true. And it makes a lot of sense because we're seeing a lot of Lyme in Florida. We're seeing in areas that have a lot of mosquitoes. So it kind of makes sense. And anything that obviously shares blood, potentially could transmit Lyme. So.
But does the tick not have to be on you for a certain time? A mosquito just boom and gone.
So, the old adage that you have to have the tick for 24, 48 hours has pretty much been disproven. And co-infections we know actually can be transmitted faster than Lyme. But some of the newer research is suggesting that even as a matter of, hours might be enough to transmit Lyme. So we don't really know the honest truth, but this 24 to 48 hours is definitely not true.
Yeah, but you're talking mosquito 10 seconds. To 10
Yeah,
minutes.
certainly. Yeah, for other insects that bite and go that don't stay attached like a tick, it may be just enough.
Because they talk about the method to put it out. If you put glue on it, it actually pukes into you, and it gives you all the diseases. You can
Yeah,
get
well,
the
when
tick.
removing ticks, these methods of trying to chemicalize the tick off. I was told, I remember as a kid,
I know,
put
but
rubbing
you can
alcohol
prevent
on
some
it.
diseases by doing it right.
Yeah, burn the tick off. That's
Yes.
a terrible idea. It freaks the tick out and it spits all its saliva into you, and that's where all the Lyme is. So you definitely don't want to do that. Grab tweezers and yank it out. They actually did a study though with peppermint oil. It was kind of interesting if you guys saw this, that they put peppermint oil and it actually did cause the tick to withdraw without excreting more of its saliva. So peppermint oil is probably safe, but you know what? I'd rather just grab some tweezers and yank the little bugger out.
What about testing for Lyme disease?
Okay, testing is a mess. So the CDC's recommended 2-tier testing is a disaster. And understand the testing that's out there in all your commercial reference labs was never, ever, ever designed to be diagnostic, ever. So back in the old days when they first discovered Lyme, they took the blood of people who had known Lyme disease, they drew their blood, they looked to see what antibodies were there. They said, okay, well, if you have Lyme, you probably have these antibodies. So it was used as a monitoring tool. Now, at the time, they didn't realize it's a terrible monitoring tool, but that's what it was designed for. So even if you go to the CDC's website, it's right there in black and white that Lyme is a clinical diagnosis. It is not a laboratory diagnosis. So all the lab's confirming is your suspicion. It's still based on your collection of signs and symptoms, and the CDC clarifies also you live in an endemic area, but what's an endemic area anymore? But at the end of the day, it really is a clinical diagnosis. So the biggest problem with the 2-tier testing, so you do the ELISA screen first, and if it's positive, it flexes over to a Western blot. As a lab person, whenever we would validate any new test, a good lab test by definition will be at least 95%
That's
sensitive.
beyond my abilities at the moment.
So, if it's not at least 95% sensitive, remember, sensitivity means if you have the disease, what's the likelihood it's going to pick it up? So it should pick it up 95% of the time. The sensitivity on the ELISA test is 43%. So literally not even half. So that tells you as a screening tool, the whole point of a screening test, right, is you're trying to pick up these people that might have the disease. It doesn't pick up half. It's a disaster of a test. And there's a lot of nuances of why it's a disaster. Part of it is the kit itself. The other part is the way it gets reported. And the way that that test is done, it's a combined IgG, IgM test. But it's got so many flaws. And what's amazing to me, again, as a former microbiologist, that in 40 plus years of research, we've never ever changed the laboratory criteria of what we call a positive Lyme test. And we've never acknowledged that the test is not a good screening tool. Again, for someone who had classic Lyme, when I did my own blood test, my Lyme ELISA screen was negative. It has never been positive. But my Lyme Western blot lit up like a Christmas tree. And I had every band imaginable. So if I had gone through the standard 2-tier testing, I would have been called negative because my lysa was negative. It never even would have flexed over to the Western blot. And if I had gone to an infectious disease doctor and they hadn't seen my bullseye rash, they would have said, well, you've got something else, it's not Lyme. So, you know, the good news now in terms of testing is we've got a lot of other labs that have come on the scene that I think offer better testing, better reporting. You know, I mean, IGNX has kind of been, you know, one of the leaders in this field, but, you know, Dr. Wajani's lab does good Lyme testing. Personally, the testing I use MDL Medical Diagnostic Labs in New Jersey. I like them because I think their test is as good as IGNX, and they bill insurance. So it's just, you know, people don't have to pay out of pocket for it. I also there's a new lab that came out last year called Global Lyme Diagnostics. If you guys don't know about this lab, they're amazing. And I don't get paid by them, but I'm actually on their scientific advisory board. And what's really interesting about their test is the standard Lyme test is only looking at Borrelia burgdorferi. We know in North America we have about 100 different strains of Borrelia, and worldwide there's about 300 strains of Borrelia. We don't even know how many are clinically relevant. But nonetheless, the standard testing is only looking at one strain. We know upwards of half the cases here in California are Borrelia miyamotoi, and there's these other strains in the Midwest and so forth. So what's really cool about Global Lyme's test is that the doctor that developed it is actually a vaccinologist. He was tasked with creating a vaccine for dogs. And to have a vaccine for Lyme, you've got to find something that's common to all Borrelia. And what's really interesting is that vets are kind of light years ahead in the Lyme world than conventional human doctors because they see so much Lyme in animals, particularly dogs. So this guy, his name's Dr. Marconi, he found a sequence on what's called outer surface protein A. And if you guys are used to looking at Western blots, outer surface protein A is the 23 band. And there is a particular sequence within that protein that is common to all Borrelia, or at least 95% of all Borrelia. So what's nice is that if someone has exposure to Borrelia burgdorferi, Borrelia guarinii, Borrelia miyamotoi, it kind of doesn't matter. It's because that sequence is common. So at least the antibody they're picking up is specific to Borrelia. So false positives with this test pretty much don't exist. Now you can still get false negatives. That's true with any Lyme test. So a negative test doesn't exclude the possibility, but at least if you get a positive test, you can be pretty confident that they've had exposure to Borrelia. So I like it because it's such a specific test. So I typically run the Global Lyme test in conjunction with MDL or IGNX. And then there's Armin Labs that does cytokine testing. So for both Lyme and co-infections, they're looking at cytokine activity, not antibodies. Any antibody test is still dependent on you having a healthy immune response. So if your immune system doesn't respond the way it's supposed to, your antibody test inherently can look negative. So you always have to consider that for anyone you suspect might have some element of immune deficiency. But the nice thing about cytokine tests is it kind of bypasses that mechanism, and particularly for people who might be very early in Lyme. You'll have cytokine activity before you'll necessarily have antibodies. So if someone just got exposed, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and you're not sure, it can take upwards of a month before your immune system makes antibodies anyway. So in those early cases, this test can be very useful to pick up early activity of Lyme, and you can start early treatment.
What do you think are the most common co-infections?
Depends on where you live. Up in the Northeast, we know that about 35% of ticks carry Lyme plus some other co-infection. So we see a lot of Bartonella. In the Northeast, we see a lot of Babesia. We see a lot of Anaplasma. Out here in California, I've probably seen Bartonella more than any other co-infection. Babesia is not as common out here. Anaplasma is not as common. The funny thing in our clinic, we have had about 12 cases of Anaplasma, and the Public Health Department of Orange County actually called the lab. They were very upset because they said there's no Anaplasma in Southern California, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you except they keep coming back positive and they have symptoms. And so we had this little cluster for a while of people that were getting Anaplasma. I don't know what to tell you, but it shows up. So you can get really any of these co-infections anywhere, but you will find regionally that there can be variances. And if you start moving down into the south, there's different kinds of ticks that carry, more rickettsia, mycoplasma pneumonia, chlamydia pneumonia. So, typically when we do testing, we just test for the whole battery of Lyme and all the co-infections, because clinically, if someone comes in with these vague symptoms of they're tired and they got joint pain and headaches, it's difficult to distinguish what's Lyme, what's Bartonella, and so forth. So.
Kaylee's gonna bring a microphone over so everybody
Oh.
can hear your question.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah.
You mentioned MDL bill insurance, is Global Lyme bill insurance?
No.
Okay, so that one is,
No, so their test is $245,
okay,
which is still a lot cheaper than a lot of the other labs out there.
that's true.
But any of the tests, like, so what we typically do is we run the global Lyme for the Lyme part of the test, and then we'll use MDL for all the other co-infections.
Have you heard of people getting Lymes from South Africa, where actually ticks were embedded in them? I'm the person from 2004, had lots of ticks. They
Yep.
were pulled out either by fire or tweezers. They say they only have tick bite fever, they don't have, which is viral, they don't have Lymes. Are you familiar with any cases in South Africa?
Well, specifically South Africa, no. But at iLads last year, there were 2 doctors from different parts of Africa that had reported Lyme in Africa. So there is Lyme in Africa. I can't speak specifically to South Africa, but I'm trying to remember. I think one doctor was from Nigeria. I think they were more Central Africa. But I mean, again, if there's ticks there, I think it's probable. The one thing that's really interesting is, again, the strain of, Borrelia we see in North America is different than the strains we see in Europe, which is different than the strains we see in Asia. So my guess is that there's a strain in Africa, it's probably different. So again, if you're doing Lyme testing here for a strain that someone might have picked up in Africa, it may be looking for the wrong bug.
Would you be able to pick something up 14 years later? Would it show up on any of these tests?
Potentially. I mean, global Lyme would be a great test because, again, if there was any kind of exposure to Borrelia, because that sequence is common to pretty much all the Borrelia strains, that would probably have the greatest likelihood of picking it up.
I've heard practitioners say that once Lyme gets chronic, because it sort of hides in the tissues, it's really hard to pick it up. So sometimes it's better to do some treatment, and that'll increase the likelihood that a test will be positive. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, in some cases, there's a doctor. I mean, his story's I think pretty kind of well known. He was an oncologist in Colorado, and he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. His name's David Martz. If you guys want to just look up his case. So Dr. Martz was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's. He was actually in hospice. He was ready to die. And one of his friends had said, "Hey, did you ever get tested for Lyme?" He said, "No." So they tested him. It was completely negative. Tested him again, negative. I think he had 6 tests, and finally said, "You know what? You got nothing to lose. Let's try some IV antibiotics." So he went on IV antibiotics, and clinically he got better. But then they tested him after the IV antibiotics, and again his Western blot lit up like a Christmas tree. So sometimes when you stir up the pot, you can get some immune activation. Remember, your immunity naturally wanes with time. So the further you get away from that infection, it's normal for the immune system or for antibody levels to drop. That's normal immunology. So if someone got exposed 10, 20 years ago, I wouldn't expect to have this massive immune response. And particularly with the Western blot test, if you guys don't know this, to call a band or an antibody positive, they compare the patient with a control, and you have to have 60% of the intensity of a control to call it positive. What's really odd in lab testing, again, having done hundreds of thousands of different lab tests, almost every test out there has a low, medium, and high control. The Lyme Western blot is the only one that only has a high control. There is no low and medium. So it doesn't account for the quantity of antibody. It's kind of like a home pregnancy test. You pee on the stick, you get that faint plus, am I pregnant, am I not? You're measuring the quantity of HCG. Well, this is the same thing. They're measuring the quantity of antibody. So, the one thing I like about MDL2 is that they'll send you a copy of this test strip, and it shows the percent of the intensity of the control. And you'll get these patients, and you'll see it's 58%, 59%. You're like, really? 1% is the difference that you do and do not have Lyme? I mean, this is the stupidity. And look, working in pathology, I've spoken to every pathologist I know, medical director, and nobody can tell me the answer of where did this 60% threshold come from? It's arbitrary. We don't really know. Somebody just said, yes. I think, someone early on probably said, well, if you've got Lyme, you make a ton of antibody. So therefore, they're going to set that bar pretty high to rule out, these false, positives. But the reality is that bar is a little too high, and it's, cutting off all these people that have had exposure.
Have you used DNA connections at all?
Never. Every test is positive. Well,
Actually negative this week.
wow, that's unusual. Well, here's the problem with DNA connections. Again, I got nothing bad to say about any lab, but as a med tech, the 2 problems I have is that any kind of DNA technology, I don't care what lab. I mean, if you're doing, GI map, if you're using Metametrics or the Genova test, where they have their own proprietary DNA technology, the problem with any DNA technology is the primer. And the primer is that little thing we use that codes for the sequence of that DNA strand that you're trying to identify. The reality is that we have, how many thousands or hundreds of thousands of different microbes. And how do you know that the sequence that you've identified is really unique to the organism you think it is? And so a problem is a lot of these primers haven't been validated, and anyone who comes up with their own proprietary technology, they may have identified a sequence that's common to E. coli or whatever the bug is, but they've not necessarily validated that it's not also common to some other microbe. And even in DNA Connections website, they say that 91% of their tests come back positive. I'm like, that's an extremely high number, because clearly 91% of the population doesn't have Lyme disease. So when you get these, this high number of positives coming back, it always makes me question, have you validated your technology? And good labs out there will get 2 certifications. They'll be CLIA certified, which it's more of a paperwork thing, but they'll also be CAP, which is College of American Pathologists, where they get blind samples sent to them to validate whatever technology they're using is true. So the positive should be positives, the negative should be negative, and they're not CAP certified. So I think, they've got enough things that make me question their technology, and the fact that get every single test that comes back as positive kind of. And we actually ran a couple early on of healthy people that came back positive. So, you could argue, well, everyone's just been exposed to Lyme, that's why it comes back. I'm like, well, I don't know. Too many positives for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, in your book, you lay out this 5-step process for combating Lyme disease. You want to go into that for us, please?
Yeah, so, the book is written for patients. The one thing that there's a lot of Lyme books out there. Richard Horowitz wrote the Bible on Lyme disease, but I think as patients it's very hard for them to plow through the numerous antibiotic protocols, and people just get very confused. So I really wanted something that anybody could pick up, do on their own. Really, there's only one chapter in there you need a doctor for. Everything else is something that people can do on their own. So the way that I lay it out is really the first step is about gut health. I mean, this is not rocket science for everybody here. We know that the gut's kind of the cornerstone of any kind of chronic illness. So it really kind of talks about, again, how do you repair the gut? How do you restore the microflora? My own experience with antibiotics and, what the research tends to show is that when you got chronic Lyme disease, antibiotics for the vast majority of people don't work. And, Lyme itself has been shown to damage mitochondria. We know that almost all antibiotics damage mitochondria, and the longer you're on, the more mitochondrial damage you're going to have. So when you got these people with, persistent fatigue and they can't seem to get over the hump, I'm like, yeah, but you got all these things damaging your mitochondria. How are you ever going to kind of get over that hump while you're on this cycle? My patient population are people who failed antibiotics. By and large. I rarely get an acute case of Lyme disease anymore. So these are people who've already been through the ringer, tried everything else, so now they're looking for an alternative. So that's what this is really kind of about. And again, it's all the things we can do nutritionally to help, repair the gut. So, of course we talk about things like, glutamine and probiotics and digestive enzymes and, all these great nutrients and herbs that really help, reduce inflammation, heal the gut, stop the leaky gut syndrome that most patients, with Lyme and really chronic illness have, and what's kind of that step-by-step process that they can take. That's step 1.
Right.
Yeah.
So step 2, which really ties into step 1, is diet. And again, it was my own experience of trying a lot of different kinds of diets to see what worked, what didn't work, and more importantly, what's sustainable. I know right now keto is kind of like, everybody's on the keto diet. I'm not on a keto diet. But, the problem with keto is that it's really hard for people. And I don't know, my opinion, and no offense to any keto people here, but I don't think it's a sustainable diet for people. And I've had a lot of patients that have completely tanked on keto, particularly Lyme patients. So what I discovered is what I found is an alkaline diet seems to help. And really an alkaline diet is just a hybrid of paleo. I think what happens when people say I'm on paleo diet is they consume a lot of animal protein.
Yeah.
And what we know is when you eat a lot of animal protein, the breakdown product, of course, is nitrogen, which then of course becomes very acidic. And the end product of that is inflammation. So it's possible to swing that pendulum too far the other direction, consume too much animal protein, And that doesn't necessarily work well for either. And I think if we kind of go back to true paleo, when we were really hunters and gatherers, we didn't kill every day, as far as I know. We killed when we could, so we weren't eating animal, woolly mammoth every day. It's kind of whenever we could. So I think we still ate a mostly plant-based diet. And it's really interesting when you write a book, if you've ever done this, you do a ton of research and read all these research articles. And I had heard about an alkaline diet in naturopathic school, and everyone always talked about it. I was gobsmacked. Do you know how many research articles there are on alkaline diet? 3. That's it. There was 3, and one was Deanna Minich. She just published it like 2 years ago. So I had to laugh. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's been all these books around an alkaline diet, and like nobody's done any research on this. It was pretty funny. But at least the studies that were done were always very promising. And I think the thing for me, when I read the one article that's like the one big article, is that they showed that there was a lot of cellular repair on an alkaline diet. And physiologically, your cells function by and large in an alkaline state, with the exception of the stomach, the bladder, and for women, the vaginal area, which is very acidic to protect against outside invaders. The rest of your body actually functions in an alkaline state. So it makes kind of a lot of sense that we're eating things that keep our body in that alkaline state. And this is really easy for people to do. They can go buy pH strips at the pharmacy and pee on a stick, 30 minutes after they eat, and kind of see which way their body's going. And I find, once people do this for 2 or 3 weeks, they kind of get a sense of where their pH is. And okay, now I don't have to keep peeing on the little strip. But it's really a plant-based diet. We try and restrict animal protein to less than 20% of your dietary intake. And then there's kind of a list of no-nos, which is basically junk food. It's dairy products, of course, gluten if you're sensitive. And then the one that everybody hates me for is coffee. I love coffee, and I can just speak from experience. When I was in the throes of Lyme, literally if I had a sip of coffee, my neuropathy would flare up in minutes. And after trying this, stopping, starting, it dawned on me that I can't have coffee. And so this concept, well, it's just a little bit, it's okay. No, when you're really sick, it's not okay. And you kind of have to get militant with your patients and just say, look, I know it sucks, but if you want to get well, this is a step you can do. And you've got complete control over what you put in your mouth. So, but what I found about this, again, is that it's sustainable. People can do this. It becomes a lifestyle. And the nice thing is that you're not really being deprived of too much. You can still have everything you like to eat. It's just you're shifting the quantity of which ones you eat. So, look, I'm from Indiana. We're meat and potato people. I love steak, but I don't eat it every day now. I have it, a couple times a week, and that's fine. And I feel satiated, but eating more plants I still feel full and happy. And but I mean, initially, again, I felt a huge difference. So, now I'm a bit more liberal with my diet because I'm not in the same state. But when people are first starting, this is really kind of an easy, inexpensive thing that people can do.
Can you tell us what protein you would suggest if it's no animal, no dairy, what, and it's mainly plant-based, so what are the proteins can patients have?
So, it's really interesting. There's kind of this myth that when you follow a plant-based diet, you might be protein deficient, and they really haven't ever shown that to be true. Because there's small amounts of protein in a lot of other vegetables and legumes and whole grains. So I mean, I still have people eat millet and quinoa and legumes, and by and large, you can get plenty of protein.
What about the deadly lectins?
I'm not in the lectin camp at all. I just, that's not been my clinical
Dr.
experience.
Gundry begs to differ with you.
I know a lot of people beg to differ with me on that. And the problem is a lot of the high lectin foods are really very nutrient dense foods. And again, my experience is I've really not found to be high lectin foods for most people to be problematic. The one thing we do in our clinic is that we do a lot of testing for food sensitivities, and I'm still a big proponent of identifying what's specific to the person. Instead of, it's very easy to have a blanket, everybody should be on this diet. I mean, look, I wrote a book, so I had to have something to kind of, this is a catch-all. But I do mention that, it's important to identify what bothers you. And that does vary from person to person.
What kind of food sensitivity testing do you do?
We do a combination in our clinic of 3 things. We do skin patch testing, which is more of an IgE mediated kind of reaction. We do intradermal provocation neutralization testing, which is an environmental medicine technique. Do you guys know about PN testing?
No.
PM?
Yeah, provocation neutralization. So provocation neutralization, it's a needle technique, and what you do is it's an intradermal injection, And let's say we're going to test wheat, and we run up different dilutions of wheat, and we'll inject it with a high dilution to try and provoke a symptom. And then we sit there with the patient and we say, well, how do you feel? And if you get a headache or your joints hurt, and then we'll keep giving you serial dilutions until the symptoms stop. So the cool thing about it is that by provoking the symptom, you can prove to people what symptoms are correlated with each different food. It's a bit labor intensive, but it's also really powerful for patients, because when you inject them with dairy and they fall asleep, oh, that's why I'm tired all the time. Yes, because you drink milk every day or you eat ice cream or whatever it is. So it's a really cool technique, because again, you're able to validate in a pretty short period of time how each of these individual foods react. Again, from a practical standpoint, it's just hard because it can take an hour to test one food. So when you've got a lot of food sensitivities, I mean, it's not uncommon people come in for 2 or 3 days to do, 20,
Do you
30
have
foods.
one of your staff do it?
Yeah, we have an MA who does our testing. Yeah, I don't do it. No, we have staff that does that. And then we also do some esoteric testing. So I do electrodermal screening in my practice.
What is that?
Electrodermal screening,
Which
so
is what?
it's biofeedback. Yeah, so I mean, I've been doing it for almost 20 years, and I find, certainly for like late delayed reactions, it's been a better test than anything else out there. And actually, I used to work with a gynecologist up in the Bay Area who's an MD, and we did a blind study where they did skin testing, then sent samples, and we did electrodermal, and we had a 90% correlation, so it was actually matching pretty
So
well.
how does this biofeedback testing work?
So basically, patient sits in a chair, and there's a computer and a device, and they hold the bar, and we get a series of skin measurements from their hand. So what we know in the world of physics is that cells change electrically before they change chemically. So what we're really looking at are very subtle electrical patterns that kind of predict how your body's going to react chemically. So if you think about even histamine, before your body reacts, mast cells degranulate, histamine gets released. Before that whole process happens, there's something happens at a very subtle electrical level. And what we know in cellular physics is that every biological substance has an electromagnetic frequency that's kind of like a fingerprint. So, when we're putting these different signals into people, they don't know if it's apple, banana, chicken, pear. We're just measuring how their body responds to that electrical signal. So it's basically biofeedback.
It's all IgE though, right?
No, it has nothing to do with IgE at all.
So, do you do IgG and IgA testing?
I don't do IgG at all. IgG is a good reflection of what you eat,
Yeah.
and very poorly reflects what actually bothers you, unfortunately. So IgE, of course, is true allergy. Yeah, I mean, that's, more anaphylactic hives, that kind of
Right.
stuff. And that's not what most people experience. I mean, the gold standard for any testing is, elimination diet. You just pull the foods out, add them back in. It's hard for people, but I mean, that is the gold standard of any testing. And again, it's cheap and easy. So if you can get people to do an elimination diet, that's always the best way. But for people who don't want to go through that, which is most of my patients, we at least have a few different ways that we can help, try and figure out what's bothering them.
Could you repeat that? Could you
Right.
repeat
Do
that
you
question?
still do the urine testing where you do the sublingual therapy in response to the homeopathic drops?
Well, sublingual immunotherapy is the treatment.
Right, but do you still, there was another kind of testing in you did.
We do have people who will send in urine sometimes to do the biofeedback thing. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
You can
So
do it
that
from
is the
blood.
same- that
It's the
is
same
the
thing,
same.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, part of the way we treat it is we do what's called sublingual immunotherapy. So once you identify the food or the substance that bothers them, whether it's mold, pollen, dust, sublingual immunotherapy has been around for 60, 70 years. It's widely used throughout Europe. There's literally 800 studies on it, and it's just putting those drops. So the concept's like allergy shots. Instead of injecting it, we just put it under the tongue. But it's a way of desensitizing people. And what's interesting immunologically is that Th2 pathway that drives allergies, the same pathway that drives autoimmunity by and large. So it's like as you get a toehold on that Th2 response, you start down regulating it. A lot of people stop having a lot of these autoimmune issues too.
Hey, in terms of the gut and Lyme, do you see a lot of dysmotility issues?
Yes.
And or GERD?
Both. And they're probably related. Yeah, dysmotility, I think my observation or maybe my opinion, I think what happens with Lyme, because there's so much neural inflammation, that it probably affects vagus nerve, which ultimately affects motility. But most Lyme patients I see start having, almost like gastroparesis and chronic constipation and urinary problems too. We'll see that they'll complain of difficulty urinating, feel the pressure, can't really go. So it's almost like that mechanism that would normally kind of squeezes the bowel, squeezes the bladder, it gets kind of lost. So it's pretty common.
So then it would trigger like a SIBO issue from that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the SIBO that we see in Lyme patients is just secondary to dysmotility.
Dr. Ibarra, who spoke at a meeting a couple of months ago, he felt in particular that, he feels in particular that methane SIBO patients tend to be ones where Lyme is involved as part of their condition.
Yeah. I don't know if I can't say that the Lyme patients I see who also have SIBO, that one's been more method and hydrogen, they seem to be fairly equal, but.
Okay.
This is going back to the Lyme testing. What do you think of, or are you aware of the new immunoblot testing by IGeneX, and what do you think about its sensitivity compared to the MDL?
Well, the test kit that IGeneX uses with their immunoblot, it's a different, so most kits out there are Borrelia burgdorferi senza stricto, and theirs is Borrelia burgdorferi senza lata. And so the senza stricto is actually more of a lab strain of Borrelia, where the senza lata is more of the wild type. And so the reason IGeneX claims that their sensitivity is better is it's more representative of what people actually have, not what you grow out in a lab. They might be right. My experience with MDL in terms of positives, though, has been kind of about the same. We for a while we did run parallel with IGeneX just to kind of see, and by and large, when IGeneX was positive, MDL was positive. When they were negative, they were negative. And the bands that were coming up were pretty much the same. So I didn't see a big difference, and again, really just because of the cost. I mean, if you do, Lyme full, co-infection testing with IGeneX, it's $1,800 or more. And to have it billed by insurance. The only thing that IGeneX still does that MDL doesn't do is the relapsing fever profile. MDL doesn't offer that. So I still run that through IGeneX, and the Babesia fish, MDL doesn't do that either. So I run that through IGeneX. But their test kit is different.
So there's, oh yeah, go ahead.
I thought that MDL was better for co-infections. Do you find it versus good for Borrelia?
No, I mean, I use it for co-infections too. It's funny. I mean, I obviously I follow a lot of Lyme blogs and Facebook pages, and it's like everyone's got their own opinion. I know that Kat up in the Bay Area thinks, oh no, MDL is terrible for co-infections. I think it hasn't been my experience. And again, we've run other labs. We've run Quest, we've done IGeneX, and the test kit actually for co-infections, most of them are the same test kits. So people want to believe that they're getting something magical through IGeneX, but they're buying the same test kit for co-infections that Quest is using. So for a lot of the co-infections, the big difference really is in the Lyme testing, but a lot of the co-infection testing, they're using the same test kits.
Another question. I've recently been getting a lot of borderline equivocal IgM positive on just LabCorp for Borrelia, and who do I need to refer to? All of those? Or?
Well, on LabCorp?
Yeah.
Well, LabCorp doesn't report borderline. It's positive or negative.
Western blot. So
Yeah.
equivocal.
Oh, I've never seen an equivocal report.
So
Usually it's just
Western
reactive,
blot.
non-reactive.
Maybe it's plastic, but one of those labs is like less than.
Well, I can tell you equivocal practically means weak positive.
Their tag is positive, but it's weak.
Yeah.
So
So if it's a Lyme-specific band, then I would, and if they have clinical symptoms, I would treat. So remember 18, 34, 39, and 93. Those are your Lyme-specific bands. 31 cross-reacts a lot with Epstein-Barr. So when you see 31, we sort of say it's like a semi-Lyme specific band, but it can also cross-react with Epstein-Barr. But the 18, 34, 39 is actually probably, and 23, there are the Lyme specific bands. 39 is probably the one that's most sensitive for acute Lyme. So when you see 39, again, you know that they've had exposure.
So I'm sorry, I was writing 23, 39 or?
18, 23, 34, 39, and 93. Those are the most Lyme specific bands. The other ones are not as specific.
Which one for
31.
So you mentioned Bell's palsy, so I'm wondering how often you see that with Lyme's, and I'm also wondering how often you might see trigeminal neuralgia.
Bell's palsy I rarely see. I mean, out of the thousands of patients, and I can probably count on less than 2 hands the number of people that had Bell's palsy, so I don't really see it that often. Again, that tends to be more associated with acute Lyme, and I think when it happens with a lot of people with acute Lyme is often they do go to like an urgent care center, you know, they're really freaked out, and so they go somewhere else. So I don't see it as often. Trigeminal neuralgia, I haven't seen a lot of related to Lyme. I mean, I think, you know, again, it's a cranial nerve, so any kind of neural inflammation could affect any cranial nerve, but that hasn't something that's really been common in my practice.
Okay, I also, okay.
Oh, I was going to ask, you mentioned that case of ALS. How many cases of ALS do you think are actually related to Lyme?
That's a great question. You know, well, in my clinic, I would say like MS. MS is Lyme until proven otherwise. And on an MRI, you can't differentiate lesions from MS versus lesions from Lyme. They look identical. If you talk to any radiologist, they'll tell you this. So, I mean, my Lyme turned into MS. So, you know, when I got diagnosed, I'm like, oh, you know, it's just a manifestation of Lyme. And the radiologist is like, yeah, you know, you can't tell the difference. But I think, you know, Dr. Martz's case, so it was really interesting with Dr. Martz. I really didn't finish the story, but after he went through a series of treatment, he completely recovered and he went back into practice. He was an oncologist before, you know, treating cancer. And then he went on to treat just Lyme patients, and he retired, I think, a year or 2 ago at like 80 years old. So
wow.
It was a really, I mean, he practiced for another, I don't know, 15 plus years after that. And he had a complete recovery from ALS. So I think, again, any of these chronic neurological conditions, that should be on your radar. Anyone who comes into my clinic who's got Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, MS, any of these kind of neurological diseases that really don't have an explanation, let's rule it out as a possibility.
I mean, somebody should really do a study. ALS has no treatment at all. Why not take a bunch of ALS patients and put them on a Lyme protocol?
Yeah, we have one ALS patient right now who, I mean, actually tested CDC positive to Lyme. He's undergoing treatment now, and I mean, it's early, so we'll see. But
you should publish that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if we get some good response out of it. You know, the only thing I worry about with ALS in particular, because of this extent of neurological damage, can it get to the point, even if the infection triggered it, that we can't undo the damage that's been done?
Sure.
And I think that certainly is possible. So ideally, you want to catch these people very early in that process. You know, I just spoke with a woman today who was just diagnosed with MS last week, and she's got very mild symptoms. I mean, she's ambulatory, and you know, but she's got a little foot drop and this and that. So I'm very hopeful for her that, you know, she's got a positive Lyme test, and by starting now, we can reverse that and get her motor function back. But I think you can't get to a point where you've had enough neurological damage that I don't know at that point if you can reverse it. Yeah.
One more question. Just wondering what's going on with Lyme globally. So do we have the most Lyme disease here in the United States?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, we have the most. Well, you know, look, Lyme was
We're the
discovered
best.
here. It's not a competition, but we're winning. So, you know, Lyme was discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. It's named after a city. Literally, it's 20 minutes down the road from where I practice in Connecticut. And, you know, that's where we discovered it. But Lyme is not new. You know, they pulled an Iceman out of Austria that's 5,000 years old, and when they extracted the blood from this Iceman, they found DNA of Borrelia. So this is not a new bug. And, you know, if you kind of go over history, you know, we've had, you know, times where certain bugs have been very virulent. I mean, there was a time that the plague and tuberculosis, you know, wiped out 1/3 of the world, and they don't do that anymore. And it's not because we have great antibiotics, it's just the nature of how the bug mutates and becomes something slightly different. And, you know, there was a time even, you know, strep, I mean, rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease used to be very common, and as long as I've been in practice, I mean, I've rarely seen that. So, I mean, it's the nature of microbes that they change and mutate. So who knows, you know, of course there's a whole conspiracy theory that it's a government thing and that, you know, Plum Island and that whole thing. I mean, who knows? But, you know, it's also true that, you know, a lot of microbes naturally change without government intervention. So
We're making America Lyme again.
yeah, exactly. But, you know, as Ben said earlier, you know, we know that we have about 300,000 new cases. I understand that's not 300,000 cases, that's 300,000 new cases every year. So we're literally a population of millions and millions of Lyme people, and in Europe it's about 65,000. In Europe it is more grossly underreported than it is here in the US. So the Europeans, as bad as we are, they're worse. And they have a ton of Lyme. And it's kind of interesting when my book came out, I'm talking to my publisher, is when you write a book, if you didn't know this, and I didn't know this, they only publish the rights in the US. They don't sell it anywhere else. So outside the US, another publisher has to print it. And so they were talking with European publishers, and they're like, yeah, there's really not a lot of interest in Europe. I'm like, really? Because they have a ton of Lyme disease. So actually, the one country that's publishing is Poland. Apparently Poland's very up on Lyme disease. And actually I know Germany is too. Germany's very up on Lyme. But you know, England, where there's a ton of Lyme, and in France, they're kind of like here, the government kind of downplays it. And I've got several patients in Australia. The Australian government has just flat out said there is no Lyme in the entire country. We've tested all the ticks and there's no Lyme. I'm like, really? You tested every tick? That's amazing. That sounds very labor intensive. But again, they're looking for Borrelia burgdorferi. Well, it's probably a different strain. They're probably looking for the long bug.
Do you find anything with women in perimenopause and menopause, that transition where symptoms might increase, or handling them is a little bit different, or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, women, when they go through the change, particularly because of that hormonal influence on the immune system, it does start to teeter that Th1, Th2 response. So a lot of my Lyme patients, when they become, particularly if they got Lyme before they were perimenopausal, perimenopause gets to be a rough patch. And I'm not exactly sure why, but my guess is that it's kind of like pregnancy. Pregnancy shifts the Th1, Th2. Menopause does the same thing. So I'm guessing it's just that shift in the immune system that sometimes allow the symptoms to get a little bit worse.
And in treating it, do you find anything that you have to do that's special? Because are you using antimicrobials? I don't work with Lyme, so I don't.
Well, yeah, that's the next topic we have to go into,
Yeah.
the herbal protocols.
Yeah, well.
So can you, when you talk about the herbal protocols, will you just drop in there because a lot of them are very, from Chinese medical perspective, they're very clearing, they're going to aggravate the hell out of a woman going through the change. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, and a lot of times, we are actually using hormone therapy to help kind of balance things out, and that does help clinically.
Yes, so I think we need to get into the herbal
Treatment.
protocols, the treatment.
So, there's a lot of different treatment protocols. I kind of highlight two in the book because it's what I personally use and what I've used on most of my patients. But if you look at what the herbs are doing chemically, you'll see that we're kind of accomplishing the same goals. One of the protocols I said that I used initially is, I mentioned Dr. Zhang. Obviously, he's an acupuncturist. So he's actually a medical doctor from China, but, becoming an MD when you come from China here, they make it very difficult. So he's licensed as an acupuncturist and he's a Chinese herbalist. But what he did is he went through a lot of the Chinese literature and he looked at the traditional use of Chinese formulas, and then he kind of looked at the biochemistry of what the herbs actually do. So he calls it modern Chinese medicine. And by the way, he's written a book about this. If you're an acupuncturist or herbalist and want to know, it's called Lyme Disease in Modern Chinese Medicine. It's a little book, but it goes through each of the herbal formulas, talks about the individual herbs, what they do, and it's a cool little book, and it's like $7 or $8. It's a cheap book. But I like the formulas because in Chinese medicine they're always used as formulas. They're not used singly. In Western botanical medicine we use individual herbs kind of like drugs, and in Chinese medicine they don't do that. So all the formulas have a synergistic effect. They have a balancing effect. And what I liked about his protocol is that side effects, die-off reactions are actually very uncommon. So these Herxheimer reactions, which are common with most Lyme treatments, are fairly uncommon with Dr. Zhang's protocol. And again, for all you Chinese herbalists, you can probably educate me better than myself on all the Chinese properties of what you understand about being warming and cooling and so forth. I don't really look at it that way. I look at it from more of a biochemical standpoint. But again, what I have found is that there's formulas that help address the organism. And the nice thing about herbs is that whether it's Lyme, Lyme and Bartonella, Lyme and Mycoplasma, it kind of doesn't matter. The herbs address really all of it. The other thing is that with herbs, you don't kill off a lot of your normal gut microbes. So getting GI distress from herbs, again, it's not that it can't happen, but it's not common. Certainly not like antibiotics. So Dr. Zhang's formulas, if you read his book, there's a whole bunch of formulas. I kind of narrow it down to about 5 or 6 different formulas. So he has an Artemisia formula, but it's not Artemisia by itself. He's got a Hatunia formula, which is a good antimicrobial. He's got a formula that helps improve circulation. He's got a formula that's got anti-inflammatory herbs. He's got another cordyceps formula to help with energy and to help, with fatigue and these kind of things. And also it's an immune stimulator. So I kind of use that as the core for a lot of Lyme patients. And then he's got a Pueraria formula, which again helps improve circulation. I'll kind of pick and choose some of the different formulas depending on what specific symptoms people have. Obviously, if someone has a lot of joint pain, we want more of the anti-inflammatory things. If they got more peripheral neuropathy, we might change the formulas. But again, you can kind of mix and match to find what works. So his are encapsulated formulas. The dosing on it for most of them is 1 capsule 3 times a day for most adults. Sometimes we scale it back depending on the response. I've also used a lot of, I don't know if you guys know Dr. Cowden. Lee Cowden was a cardiologist in Dallas. I think he's semi-retired now. And he's got a whole protocol where every month you change all of the herbs, and the goal is to kind of constantly confuse the organism so it never really gets caught up. And that's fine. What I found practically is it was very labor-intensive, very expensive, and very confusing for patients. So Dr. Eva Sappi, who's a researcher at University of New Haven, actually looked just at a few of these herbs, and she compared it with doxycycline. And what she found is that the herbs work better than doxycycline, and also addresses Lyme in different forms, where doxy only works when Lyme's in its uncoiled form. So I use just 4 of those formulas primarily. One's called Cemento. It's a cat's claw extract, which is a good anti-Lyme, anti-inflammatory. And then there's 2, one called Banderol, one called Kumanda. All these plants, by the way, come from South America near the Amazon, Peru, that area. And both Kumanda and Banderol are from a bark of a tree that grows down there. But again, they're also very potent anti-Lyme and anti-co-infection. They also have a little bit of anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects. And then there's a product called Berber, and Berber is really about detox. So Berber is really kind of there to help offset a lot of that die-off reaction that you get when you're treating Lyme. So I find just using those 4 tinctures for a lot of people work really well without having to do the whole very labor-intensive, Cowden protocol. And there's a bunch of other herbs out there, and like Byron White, who's an herbalist, has some great formulas. They're very potent. Even drop doses, people will Herx on them. That's part of the reason I don't really start with that. The Herxing is pretty bad. Same with Beyond Balance. They're great herbs. Susan McCamish has put together some good formulas, but a lot of people Herx on them. Of course, Stephen Buhner's got a whole protocol. Again, they all work, and sometimes one protocol just works better than another. So my feeling is whatever protocol you start on, give it a good 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, see how people are doing, and if they're really not responding, fine, move on. You don't have to keep beating a dead horse. But if they're improving, now you know that what you're doing is working, and you stay with it. So sometimes we'll start people, and at 6 weeks they're like, look, my headaches are better, my joint pain's better, but I'm not completely better yet. Okay, fine, but we're on the right track. So we'll stay with that until I feel like I'm hitting a plateau or they're regressing.
For patients who have those die-off reactions, are you using binders, clay, or
Yeah, so
charcoal?
for Herx reactions, there's a lot of really simple things. Actually, my favorite is trisalts. You guys know trisalts? Trisalts? So this is an old environmental medicine thing for allergic reactions. I mean, I've had kids in the middle of an asthma attack. You start giving them trisalts, it'll stop their asthma attack. But it's also great for Herx reactions. So trisalts is sodium, potassium, and calcium bicarbonate. And it's the bicarbonate. And it's the same reason we talk about an alkaline diet. It's an alkalizing agent. And when you alkalize the body, it really helps mitigate those Herx reactions. So trisalts comes as either a powder or capsule, just depends on what your patient prefers. It's chalky. It doesn't taste great, but it does work. And so I'll have people take trisalts every hour, every 2 hours while they're in the midst of a Herx, and usually within a matter of hours that starts to quiet things down, they feel better. So baking soda is your cheap way. Most people keep a box of Arm & Hammer baking soda in their fridge, and you can pull that out. That's sodium bicarbonate. We know that potassium bicarbonate is a much better alkalizing agent than sodium bicarbonate. The other product that works great is Alka-Seltzer Gold. So Alka-Seltzer is sodium bicarbonate with aspirin. Alka-Seltzer Gold is potassium bicarbonate with no aspirin. And so you want the Alka-Seltzer Gold, not regular Alka-Seltzer, but plop, plop, fizz, fizz. And that works pretty well. And it's also nice for people when they travel. that they can just keep it in their purse or their luggage. And carrying a big bag of white powder around in a baggie probably is a good idea going through TSA these days. But at least Alka-Seltzer Gold, you're probably pretty safe. But those work great. And if someone's on the Cowden protocol, you can use the Berber. If someone's on Dr. Zhang, they can use what's called AI number 3. So most of these herbal protocols have something you can take as part of it to offset that Herx reaction. But I find, honestly, just alkalizing people will often help stop it.
Use IV glutathione.
Yeah, the IV stuff's great. Again, for most people, it's just an access issue and money issue. And if they're in the middle of a Herx, at midnight, they're not going to come in and get an IV of glutathione. So I think, in between is a way to helping with improve their detox pathways. And honest to God, the best detox out there is colon hydrotherapy. People hate doing colon hydrotherapy.
Oh, colon hydrotherapy.
Colonics.
Yeah.
I have had patients that have done every therapy under the sun and nothing worked, and they get a handful of colon hydrotherapy treatments and they feel 1,000 times better. So, find a good colon hydrotherapist, and if you can get people over the mental hurdle of sticking something up their butt, it makes such a huge difference. And they've done actually some good research. You pull out heavy metals, you pull out chemicals, you're pulling out different toxins. And if you've got a person who's got a mold problem, you're trying to get rid of mycotoxins, there's just so many health benefits. Not to mention that you're also stimulating the vagus nerve. So most of our Lyme patients end up in some sort of fight or flight sympathetic overload. So this is a great way to kind of just down-regulate them. It's going to help with their sleep and all these other issues that come up.
What about coffee enemas for the same purpose?
Coffee enemas are a little different. I mean, coffee enemas are still helpful for detox, but because it's kind of a one-and-done thing, where with colon hydrotherapy, you fill, you drain, you fill, you drain, you fill, you drain. And you do that multiple times over the course of an hour treatment. So you get a far more vagal stimulation with colon hydrotherapy than you do with the coffee enema. But again, in a pinch, I just say be careful with coffee because a lot of people are very sensitive to coffee. So even just a plain warm water enema can help.
Dr. Zhang, how did you spell his name?
Zhang.
Oh, that's not what I thought. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you're, as practitioners, his website is hepahealth.com. Interestingly enough, their distribution centers in Irvine. So for all of us here, I mean, my practice in Irvine, they're so sweet that when I order, they actually just drop it by our office. They don't even mail it. They drive over and give us a big bag. But yeah, they're very nice, and they're funny on their website. They list nothing about the herbs other than saying we carry it. They don't want any FDA issues, so they make not even like structure function claims. So it would be a good idea if you're interested in using the herbs, pick up the book, just read up on what the formulas are, what they're doing, and you can call them. Warren is the guy who runs it there. His brother-in-law is Dr. Zhang, who's in New York City. And as I understand, Dr. Zhang's kind of semi-retired now. I'm not sure how old he is. I think he's probably close to 80. But you can even set up a consultation with Dr. Zhang if you want to just learn more about what he's doing. And certainly if you're an acupuncturist or Chinese herbalist, this would be very helpful.
What's Dr. Zhang's first name?
I won't even try to pronounce it because I will butcher it. It's Qincao. Qincao? I don't know.
What's the name of the company in Irvine?
Well, the website's hepahealth.com. The company's actually called Hepa Pro, but the website's hepahealth.com. Yeah.
You mentioned a number of other nutrients, particularly to help with mitochondrial support.
Yeah.
So you mentioned CoQ10, L-carnitine, lipoic acid.
Yeah, so CoQ10, we have what we kind of call the mito cocktail. So CoQ10, and I actually use a lot of acetyl L-carnitine. Most of the research on acetyl L-carnitine is more on like age-related cognitive decline, but we think that there's better penetration into the brain with acetyl L-carnitine over just L-carnitine. So I've used, CoQ10, acetyl L-carnitine, B6 in particular, lipoic acid. The one thing about these nutrients, though, if we think there's been a lot of mitochondrial damage, what I kind of learned in my own practice is that I was really underdosing. When you've had a lot of mitochondrial damage, you can't pussyfoot with this stuff. You got to get pretty good amounts. So I'll usually start people at 400 milligrams of CoQ10, go up to 1,000. Make sure they take it early in the day. Don't want to take it late at night. And acetyl L-carnitine, again, we'll give anywhere. Acetyl L-carnitine, at least the company I use, it's 340 milligrams per cap. So again, we'll start usually with 2 or 3 caps a day and kind of go up from there. With carnitine, if you guys don't know this, if you give too much, it can cause diarrhea, and they smell like fish. So if people start complaining of like this weird fishy body odor, then bring the dose down. It's too much. And same thing with B6. You can give high doses of B6, and it doesn't really matter if it's pyridoxine or P5P. If you get too much B6, and too much B6 for an adult is probably over 500 milligrams a day, you can get what's called stocking glove paresthesia. So between the elbow and the tips of their fingers, knee down to the feet, you can get this paresthesia. It goes away completely when you cut the dose down, but if you find that your patients are complaining of that, just bring the dose down. And of course, magnesium, which is a cofactor in every energy pathway in the body. Again, you can give it up to bowel tolerance. Just keep giving it until they get loose stool, and then just back off the dose a little bit.
You mentioned NADH.
Yeah, NADH, has been Jacob Teitelbaum. If you guys have read his book on fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, it's been around a long time. Again, it's NAD is a major cofactor in energy metabolism. There's actually some pretty interesting stuff, not research, but you might have heard that they're now doing it IV NAD, and we haven't done it in our clinic yet, but it's kind of on our list of things to add. But at least anecdotally,
like drug rehab, right?
Yeah, they've actually used it, getting people like off opioid addiction and things of that nature. So I think it's interesting, and we've yet to do it in our clinic, but I've heard good anecdotal evidence of people really feeling like it helped with their energy. So I think we're looking into, but you can buy oral NADH, it's cheap.
You mentioned magnesium, and I was wondering, is there a specific type of magnesium that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I use really two forms. I use mag citrate and I use mag 3 and 8. Mag 3 and 8 has that better penetration into the brain. So when I have the people who are like the chronic insomniacs and more of the neurological stuff, I'll use the mag 3 and 8. But if it really is just sort of general magnesium support, the mag citrate is just a little bit cheaper. But I mean, honestly, they've done studies comparing all the different magnesiums. With magnesium, it really doesn't matter. Even mag oxide, which everyone bashes, does work. So.
You mentioned the 5-step process. I kind of lost you where we're at with that. Have we gotten to 3 yet?
So so step 1 is gut. Step 2 is diet. Step 3 is treat the infection. So that's all the herbal protocols. We haven't really gotten to step 4 yet.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
I had a question about the immune system. Can
Yeah.
you talk about the TH1, TH2 balance, what Lyme does to that?
Yeah, so what Lyme does is it really drives more of the TH2 response.
Okay.
So the TH2, TH1, T helper 1 cells are the ones that are really more of your direct scavengers. They don't need second messenger system, where TH2 really is more about antibody response. So Lyme tends to drive more of a TH2 response. And what happens is, as your TH2 cells increase, it secretes as a cytokine that actually suppresses TH1, and vice versa.
Should we go into the other
Part 4?
couple of steps? Yeah.
Sure. Part 4 is pretty quick.
Yeah.
So part 4 is really about environmental control. And this is everything that, external that might be influencing your immune system. So, it's about, cleaning up the house, getting people away from toxic chemicals. These toxic chemicals, the average American is now exposed to 80,000 separate chemicals every year. And, we do have a body burden. And of course, for heavier people, that's a bigger problem because most of this is stored in fat tissue. And we all know that most Americans now are obese, so it's a problem. So it's really about educating patients about cleaning up their home environment, getting rid of toxic chemicals, don't use, pesticides and herbicides and all these things that just add to their load. And the big one on there is mold. I was surprised coming from the East Coast, where of course everything's old and mold's always been a problem. I think I have got more mold problems out here with California people than I did on the East Coast. And Ben and I were talking about this earlier. I think part of it is that the way houses are built out on the East Coast, they're ventilated better because they expect mold, and we have basements. So we can tell when there's mold because it'll eventually make its way to your basement. You'll see a little pool of water. Well, in California, there's no basements, and when there's a leak, most people don't know about it. And so therefore it can go on longer before people really start to recognize that there's a health issue. But the one thing that mimics Lyme more than anything else is mold. And if you started your patient down a Lyme road and they're not really responding, if you haven't looked at mold, that should be investigated. And I recommend everybody nowadays get your house tested. I've always been amazed how many people who said, no, I've never had a leak, I'm fine, there's no problem. And then they test their home, oh yeah, I got Stachybotrys in my house, and I got toxic levels of mold, and they had no idea. So, it's not cheap, but it's worth the investment when it's your health. And I said, particularly if you've kind of hit a wall with Lyme treatment and you're not getting a lot of progress, that's something worth investigating. And Great Plains Labs now does a less expensive urine mycotoxin test relative to real-time labs. Real-time is like $800. Great Plains now, I think it's $300 or $400, so it's more than half the price, cheaper. So it's more affordable now, and you can identify if someone's got mycotoxicity. With mold, remember, there's mycotoxicity and mold allergy. They're two completely different problems related to mold. Not all molds secrete mycotoxins, but all molds do make spores. And the immune reaction to mold spores can cause a lot of the same symptoms that look like mycotoxicity. And if you follow Richie Shoemaker at all, who's a big mycotoxin guy, he really ignores mold allergy. I will argue that mold allergy for most people, especially Lyme patients, is a bigger problem than the mycotoxicity. Mycotoxicity is a function of water damage. So if you haven't been in a water damaged building, you're probably not likely to have mycotoxicity. But if you live in an area where there's mold, which is pretty much most of the country, those mold spores can become immune triggers. So they're tested in different ways. Mold allergy you would test through more conventional allergy methods, where mycotoxicity is generally the urine test. But identifying mold as a whole to see if that's part of the problem, for a lot of Lyme patients, they kind of go hand in hand. So that's part 4. And part 5 is really just about lifestyle.
Oh, yeah, she has a question.
Yeah, please.
By the way, when Darin and I were talking about the buildings, I've talked to builders here, and they basically make your walls and your house so tightly sealed, because they're not worried about it, that if mold does get growing, you don't know about it. And that's the issue. So if you're having construction done, you want to make sure your walls are vented so that air gets in between.
Yeah.
Apart from obviously remediating the mold, what's your favorite way to address mycotoxicity and colonics?
So in terms of getting rid of mycotoxins, I like binders. I am not a huge fan of cholestyramine. I know that's Shoemaker's go-to. It's not that it doesn't work, it does. It tastes terrible, it's very expensive, and the problem is the standard stuff you get at the pharmacy has got aspartame in it, and the stuff that doesn't have sweetener, the stuff with sweetener is horrible, the stuff without sweetener is whatever worse than horrible. And just getting people to take it, it's really difficult. And honestly, I find bentonite clay works just as well. It's cheap, it's easy. You can adjust the dose per patient on what they tolerate. It's clay, it's chalky, but between bentonite clay, activated charcoal, sauna therapy, I recommend people jump in saunas if they have access, colon hydrotherapy. I've had great success at getting mycotoxin levels down.
A few mold questions. Do you trust the Great Plains mycotoxin? Have you seen any negatives? Because it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In all fairness, we're testing people we're suspicious have a problem.
Right.
So I haven't been testing just random people, but I've had some come back to be completely negative.
And then do you have people in Orange County that you trust in terms of doing the mold testing, or do you use mycometrics?
We've used mycometrics, we've used the mold guy. He's in LA.
I know.
Yes.
The mold guy, Mark, right? Yeah. I think it's Mark. Yeah, we've used the mold guy, and then I keep forgetting the company, Murray. His name's Murray. He's in LA as well, and they all do good mold testing. The thing with all of them is that those guys are pretty expensive. I had my house done in Connecticut for $500, and I had a patient just 2 weeks ago that had Mark come out. It was $6,000. Yeah, exactly. Now, understand, this was not just mold testing. He was going through individual items and doing swabs, of every piece of furniture, and I'm like, okay, that might be a little extreme. Yeah, I think you can do spore trapping, you can do an ERMI or a HERTS-ME. That's probably sufficient. If you go room by room, keep the cost down. Unless you see direct visual mold, to swab everything in your house, that's kind of stupid, and I think it's just not necessary.
Do you use IV ozone? It's very popular these days.
Never.
How come?
I just find that it's a temporary benefit at best. I've yet to see a single person that was cured doing ozone. If you do ozone, I'm sorry, I just haven't seen it. It's very expensive, and I just don't see the long-term investment on it. You know, I think IV ozone too, I think for acute Lyme would probably be great, because again, it'll kill the bug. But if you're in chronic Lyme, it's not about killing the bug anymore. It's really about all these other things of why the Lyme is persistent, and you just kill the bug. Again, I see people who do hyperbaric oxygen, IV ozone, or even the ultraviolet IV stuff. Again, they feel better for a handful of days, and then they're kind of right back to square one. So I'm more interested in things that are going to be long-term, getting people over the hump. Yeah.
Just a FYI, Standard Process makes a product that's bentonite clay, which they discontinued making. It was a beautiful product, and they discontinued it because they cannot find a single source anywhere in the world of bentonite clay that hasn't been irradiated. And so they won't make the product anymore.
Yeah, I've never used their product. There's a product you can get on Amazon that's at least to say it's an organic bentonite clay.
Yeah,
And
they're saying that they can't find any source anywhere of any kind that is not irradiated. So there's just an FYI.
yeah, well, the only thing with I said I don't use Standard Process at all. My concern is that all this stuff's contaminated with gluten, and they don't tell people that. Because they use barley as a cover crop on all their products, and they don't tell you that. So if you got gluten sensitive people,
Well, they actually now test, all the products are tested and labeled whether they're gluten-free or not. And
they don't label it, but go to their farm, and you'll see barley growing all over the place.
All the products are tested, every product is now tested, and I'm
Yeah.
gluten sensitive, I don't take a lot of the products that
Yeah.
have the gluten in it, and I can tolerate the one. I'm ridiculously gluten sensitive, and I can tolerate the ones that don't.
Yeah, maybe they've changed. You know, it's been several years, but one of my friends, he's got celiac. He's a nutritionist in Seattle, and was out at the farm. And he was taking pictures of all this barley growing, and he asked him, he's like, "You use barley as a cover crop?" Like, "Oh yeah, but there's no gluten in it." And I'm like, there's this thing called cross contamination. So, but yeah, maybe they've changed their practices.
It's not quite the same, but biobotanical research do GI detox with, I think it's pyrolit clay, or
Yeah.
you're probably familiar with it. I don't know if it's been radiated, but it's with activated charcoal. It's
Why
only a
is,
good
where is the clay getting radiated from? I'm confused.
They're irradiating it to kill off other potential toxins, and it's just
Oh, you mean the companies that make it purposely?
Yeah, it's being done, and
Radiated.
this product's been being made for years and years and years, and it's a great product and very well sold, and they've taken it off the line because they cannot find one anywhere in the world that is not showing with high radiation levels from being irradiated. So that's all I can say is what we've been told when
Yeah.
it's been discontinued, and I love the product because it is a great binder, and anyway. So.
Well, I can just tell you clinically, you know, again, having done pre and post with this product that you can get on Amazon, it's got a fossil on the label, but if you search organic bentonite clay, I think it's the only product that you can find. And clinically it works well. So yeah, I've not heard anything about it being irradiated. Although, you know, what's being called organic nowadays is getting to be kind of liberal. And I know that they've been pushing for irradiated products to be labeled organic. So, you know, that may be the case.
Once all the big corporations started buying up the organic companies, they
Yeah.
just keep pushing the limits on the regulations.
Tyler?
I have a couple of names of mold people. Marie Horoshow is one.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
From Mary Cordaro. Let's see, Murray Harrishow, I'll just give you his number instead of having to pronounce it or spell it. 310-396-6532. It's fairly reasonable. He did a house for me at one point. And then Suzanne Bennett likes Robert Navarro at Lake Shore. And that is 310-654-0380.
Great, thank you. Awesome.
0380.
Yeah, the only thing with mold testers, and I'm pretty sure, I know Murray doesn't, you just don't ever want a company that does the testing and the remediation. Big conflict of interest. So there's a few companies I've come across that say, yeah, we'll do the remediation too. I'm like, no, find another company.
You mentioned PEMF therapy as an adjunct to care.
Yeah. So we've been using PEMF, and do you guys know PEMF, pulse electromagnetic frequency? So the Germans have actually done a lot of research on this device, and so the concept is that it's putting out an electrical signal, but it resonates at the same frequency as your cells. And what they found is it helps with cellular repair and it improves circulation. There's over 1,500 studies on PEMF. So again, this is a FDA-approved device. You can actually bill for it in your office if you've got one. And again, we find clinically, people do respond, but it's kind of like physical therapy. It's not like you just do one treatment and that's it. It's something people have to do on a fairly regular basis. I actually have a device myself. It's the same company that we have professionally. They make a personal device. It's about the size of an iPhone. It plugs in your computer and you can download different programs, and I'll help patients with their programming. So there's a Lyme protocol, there's a stress protocol, there's a whole bunch of protocols. And then you just kind of put it near your body. It doesn't have to be touching your skin, it just has to be close to you. That signal goes out a fair distance. And I'll do it every day. And patients will do it frequently. And we had one who came in, an N of 1, who came in a wheelchair. She has Lyme. I mean, she can walk, but it was very difficult for her, so it was easier to get pushed around a wheelchair. And she came in, she got one treatment, and she walked out on her own. And so, sometimes we see people get pretty significant results. And again, it's non-invasive. The devices are not cheap, of course. My little device is about $1,000.
I think they're like about 30 grand, right?
Well, our professional device is $18,500.
Okay.
There's a lot of ones that are made for home use, like the Beamer is very popular. It's an MLM company. Theirs is, I think, is $6,000. The other company that we work with, they have another home device that's, I think it's around $3 grand. So it's not an inexpensive investment, but again, for the people who have that means, it's another option to offer them. And again, you're not going to harm anybody, and some people really do feel a big improvement by using it. So.
Did you say a PDF or a DMF or PMF?
PE, it's pulsed electromagnetic frequency.
A lot of chiropractors will use it for sports injuries as well.
Yeah, I was surprised. I said when I looked at the research that there's 1,500 studies. It's been very well researched, so it's not some kooky machine that no one's ever heard of. Again, it's pretty widely used throughout Europe, but Germany definitely has done the most research on it.
No question. Did you mention hyperbaric or ozone?
Oh, yeah, we just talked about it.
Okay.
And then the fifth layer is sleep.
The fifth layer. Well, the fifth layer is about lifestyle.
Okay.
So many Lyme patients you've probably seen. After they get infected, their sleep is horrible. And when you get that deep restorative sleep, that's when your brain and your tissue repairs itself, restores itself. So the more that people miss of that restorative time, it's just hard for the body to heal. So I'm all for whatever we can do to encourage better sleep. So I talk about very specific nutrients to both fall asleep, stay asleep. Most of my Lyme patients, falling asleep generally isn't the problem. They're exhausted by the end of the day. It's just they don't stay asleep. They wake up frequently in the night. So again, we can use things like 5-HTP. We can use glycine. I'm actually a big CBD oil fan. I use a lot of CBD oil in my practice, and for a lot of people that works well. So you just got to find what works for your patient that doesn't leave them feeling druggy or groggy the next morning. Exercise is another big part of it. When I had Lyme, I was not you can tell now, but I was a year-round athlete as a younger person. And after I had Lyme, it was everything I could do to get off the couch. And I became a total slug. And then I just started one day, I sat on the floor and I just stretched my legs. That's all I could do. And I sat in front of the TV while I did it. And then I did that more, and I did it more. And over time, I started walking around the neighborhood. And then after a while, I started studying martial arts, and I think 7 years later, I got a black belt in karate.
Wow.
So it took me a long time to build my stamina to kind of get up to that point. But there's so many health benefits physically, and I think even mentally. My Lyme patients are pretty depressed and pretty unhappy, and they feel terrible. And so I think it's important to emphasize that there's this mental, emotional benefit of moving your body. And I know how it is when you're exhausted to the core. The thought of doing anything, it just seems so much. But once people kind of get started on that, even with very simple things, and even for people with very limited mobility, there's usually something they can do to get their body moving. It's just helping them work through that. So I talk about, whether it's yoga or Tai Chi or swimming or walking or Qigong or whatever, you feel like people can do. And I think it's also important that they do something they like. If they don't like doing it, they're not going to do it. So, work with them and find something that they'll actually, enjoy doing. So, some kind of exercise or body movement I think is important. And then really the last part is the one thing that most of us never talk about with our patients is that kind of emotional, psychological aspect of being sick. And I think it's important that, again, I can speak from my own experience. I mean, I always have a lot of friends and family. I always felt like I had a lot of support. But at the end of the day, nobody wanted to hear about my Lyme anymore. Hey, Darin, how do you feel? Oh, great, thanks for asking. It's like, no one really wants the truth. You know what, I feel like crap today. Today's horrible. My joints hurt, my head hurts, and blah, blah, blah. So, I think even for people that might, on the external side, have a lot of people there to support them, to have that place where they can kind of just unload, be honest, dump, and flush, whether it's working with a Lyme group, a therapist, something, I think it's good for us to talk with them about that piece and what are they doing for their mental state of being, and just helping people find joy again in their life. So many people, they stop doing the things they used to love to do, maybe because they physically can't do it anymore, or maybe because psychologically they just kind of block it out. So helping them find that thing that brings them joy and happiness again can just make such a huge difference on their outlook. And for some people it's painting, for some people it's drawing, for some people it's an art thing, or some people it's music. I've had one woman, she was a piano player, and she hadn't played in years, and I mean, she kind of went back and started playing, and it really made a huge difference in her life. And even though her legs weren't working great, her hands worked perfectly fine. So it's just that kind of stuff. And so that fifth part is really just kind of about all that lifestyle stuff, and what else can we do to help support people in that process. And then the sixth part, which isn't part 6, it's not listed, but it's just, this is the part that you need a doctor for. And so I talk a lot about, I mentioned a little bit about the immunotherapy. So, helping them, deal with some of these other immune issues. Again, sublingual immunotherapy is a way to do it. We do another therapy called LDA, low dose allergy therapy. This is for like mold allergy and pollen and foods and chemicals. It's another way of taking the burden off the immune system. We do another thing called LDI, or low dose immunotherapy. You guys might be familiar with this. This is a way of taking that autoimmune response off from the microbe. So whether it's Lyme or Mycoplasma or Bartonella, if that's triggering an autoimmune event, this can kind of help turn that mechanism off.
What kind of immunotherapy are you talking about?
So this is with LDI, low dose immunotherapy is an extract of dead organism. So literally the organism's irradiated, it's killed, it can't reproduce, it can't cause infection, but it maintains the proteins intact. And then we dilute it out, and then we pull out that dilution, mix it with an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, and that helps modulate the way the immune system, whatever it's mixed with. So we have a Lyme mix, we have Bartonella, we have probably 40 different antigens in our fridge, depending on what people have been exposed to.
There's a lot of controvery about that low dose you have there. Between those swear by it, after we say.
Well, our meeting in July is going to be about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
Well, when it works, great, it's beautiful, and when it doesn't, it's a train wreck. And it's one of those. It's just one of those things that I think everyone who's doing it is doing it a little bit different, and that's maybe part of the issue. I know Dr. Hirani is going to come talk to you in July. I know she does it very different than the way that I do it, and it's not right or wrong, it's just different. And we're all trying to find what's the best way. The thing about LDI, and part of the reason it's getting a bum rap with some people, and what they don't realize, or maybe they forgot, is if you give the right antigen at the wrong dose, it's kind of like a medication. It's the right medication, but you gave too much, you're going to get an adverse reaction. In the case of LDI, when you get an adverse reaction, you've now just proven that's what the problem is. So there is a diagnostic aspect of this therapy that if you give, herpes or, Epstein-Barr and their fatigue gets worse, well, we now know that's what's causing your fatigue. And now we just need to fine tune it to find the right dilution. So when we get these bad reactions, although it stinks for the patient and sometimes it takes a while to kind of bounce back from it, we've now just proven that that's part of the problem. Because if we give a microbe and nothing happens, even as we move through a series of dilutions, we know that that's not part of the problem. We've just now said, okay, yeah, we thought it was this, and it wasn't. I'll give you just a quick example. I had a little boy come in my practice who had acute onset pandas. You guys know pandas? Yeah. So he had classic symptoms, OCD, tics, anxiety. It happened literally overnight. And I did his blood test, and his strep titers were sky high. High SO, DNA SPE. I said, okay, this is pretty much hands down slam dunk. I started giving him the strep LDI. It did nothing. kept changing dilutions, nothing. Mom tells me 4 years ago he had Lyme, he was treated. As far as she was concerned, he was fine. I gave him the Lyme LDI. That night she texts me, she's like, oh my gosh, he's got a terrible headache, what should we do? We talked through it, and the next day all his symptoms completely gone.
Wow.
2 years later, he's never had a symptom since. So he was a great example where it was classic strep, and I think what happened is he got exposed to strep, the strep reactivated the Lyme, and the Lyme's what actually triggered the symptoms. So, with LDI, there's this whole art of, trying to figure out which organism, and, we try and use tests to figure out maybe what someone's been exposed to, but sometimes we get boondoggled, and what we see on paper is not really what's actually bothering them. So if you're going to do this therapy, you kind of have to go through the process of working through different antigens. And I can tell you with Lyme patients, it's almost never just Lyme. It's almost Lyme plus whatever else. And you just have to kind of go through that process. But Dr. Honning will go through a lot more detail when you hear her in July.
Good question right here.
I was going to backtrack and ask a question about the Great Plains mycotoxin test. And do you do the Shoemaker serum testing as well? Have you compared the results?
Serum for testing for mycotoxins isn't very helpful. Most mycotoxins aren't in serum, they're in tissue.
The innate immune system markers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's all those markers. There's 1,000 of them. Most of them are academic. They don't change treatment. I know, Shoemaker uses them as a way of kind of monitoring. I use a couple of them. Like I find TGF-beta to be fairly useful, C4A. They seem to correlate pretty well with people's clinical symptoms. But again, they'll go up in Lyme, not just mold. So a lot of those mold markers are also Lyme markers, and you just kind of have to know that you're dealing with just, immune activation, and it may not necessarily be mold. But I mean, I've seen people, we treat their mold mycotoxicity and those markers come down. But like I stopped doing like, VIP and VEGF and some of these. I mean, clinically it wasn't correlating. Insurance actually wasn't paying for a lot of it too, so I kind of consolidated to my own little version of it.
You had mentioned about the low dose immunotherapy for herpes and Epstein-Barr.
Yeah.
So dosages, you have that?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And so how would it work you would give it to somebody who's got herpes and it would help eradicate the virus? Or?
Yeah, we've actually, I've used the varicella for several patients who've had shingles, and it's helped, curtail the shingles without using, acyclovir or one of the Virs. And I've had people who get chronic, mouth sores. We give them the herpes one, they stop getting mouth sores. So I've had even kids who get chronic strep throat, we'll give them the strep one and they stop getting strep throat. So there is probably a preventive aspect of this therapy too.
Which is very interesting because they're really pushing the shingles vaccine now. It's 2 parts. You get one now, you repeat one, what's it for? I think 6 months.
Yeah.
My doctor's pushing it, everybody's pushing it, but I just resisted. Do you think you can use that possibly as a preventative measure? That's very interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm kind of anxious to do and I haven't done it yet is to, particularly with siblings, if one sibling keeps getting a certain kind of infection, if we could give the healthier sibling the other one to see, does it prevent them from getting it? Now we wouldn't really know because they're just healthier and they wouldn't get it anyway. But it'd be kind of interesting just to see if there is a preventive aspect. We kind of speculate that there is, but again, there's no money in this. No one's going to dump millions of dollars into research. So, but I think it would.
Do you take insurance?
Of course not. Ironically, as a naturopath in California, insurance they don't qualify any of us. We couldn't be on insurance if we wanted to.
Yeah.
So we're all cash.
Got it.
But
How long does immunotherapy take? Is it like years?
for
Immunotherapy.
For what?
LDI.
Well, LDI kind of depends on the response. I'd say most people do end up being on it for years, but that may be multiple antigens. And again, you usually get doses every 2 months, so it's not like you're getting it all the time. But to get to people to a point where they don't need it anymore, I'd say a year and a half to 2 years is probably pretty common.
And my last question: any of your patients tried stem cell?
Yes.
Comments?
And stem cells have been hit and miss with Lyme. And I was talking to Joy Kong last night, and if you guys know Joy, she does a lot of stem cells around here. And I think her opinion, and I would probably agree, is it may be the stem cell type. not everyone's using the same line of stem cells, and so there may be a difference between whether they're umbilical versus, mesenchymal versus whatever. I'm not a stem cell expert. From my own patients who've done it, some of them have had great responses. It's made a huge difference. Other people have flown down to Panama, gone to the big clinic down there, spent, $50,000, and they feel no different at all. So, again, my feeling is if you've got the money, hey, why not? Try it. But I think the stem cells are probably going to work best for those who really have more neurological involvement. I don't.
I'm thinking about, what about diet, like fasting mimicking diet, which could possibly potentiate the stem cells?
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't be contraindicated in this population.
No, not at all. No, I think fasting mimicking diet makes a lot of sense because we've shown so much. I mean, the whole thing with it, of course, it's, enhancing tissue repair. So, of course, that's got to be beneficial. Yeah.
Okay, I think this was great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you
Awesome,
so
Darin.
much.